great that you've all made the time to come and speak with us tonight. I'll just pop this up. It's just a little bit of information about who's funding the meeting. So Westmoreland Dales are funding the meeting this evening, which is a Heritage Lottery Fund project that we're sharing with several partners throughout the Westmoreland Dales area. So I just need to make thanks to them tonight for hosting this and given us the opportunity to have some really great speakers. So we've got Alice Ritchie from the CLA, who is the Land Use Policy Advisor. We've also got Becky Wilson from the Farm Carbon Toolkit. And I just want to mention Jane Lane, who's helped me out getting this meeting together. So huge thanks to Jane as well. Kate's just going to be sort of helping me out this evening with questions and things like that. So if you have any questions, please use the chat facility. That's if you just hover over the bottom of the screen there's a chat option where you can ask a question. But there will be opportunities at the end of the talks to ask any questions, and Becky and Alice will answer those questions then. But if you do think of anything whilst the talks are going on, just let us know on the chat facility or write it down for later. I am recording the meeting just for the talks, so if you all could mute your speaker phones, that would be great, just in case there's any interference comes through. And then that'll be great. We're going to start off with, and Alice Ritchie is going to talk over the policy and the net zero aspects of greenhouse gases and carbon. Becky will then go on and talk about the toolkit, carbon footprints, and reducing the emissions and opportunities for sequestration. So I'll just come out of that now. Alice, are you okay to pop up your start of your presentation?
Yeah, I can.
That would be great. Is there any questions from anybody just to start off with? Just raise your hand. Is everybody happy?
So can you all see my screen?
Yep. Is everybody happy with that? Okay. Right. Well, I'll hand over to Alice, who will do her start of the presentations. If you'd like to go ahead, Alice, I'll mute myself.
That works.
You all right, Alice?
Not a good start. So yeah, my name's Alice Ritchie. I am the CLA Policy Advisor for climate change and for but today we will be running through sort of some of the wider climate change issues around agriculture and land use more generally. I won't profess to be an expert on carbon accounting. I think that's probably Becky, so I'll leave all of the kind of technical carbon accounting stuff to her, but I'll do some of the more wider net zero climate change kind of stuff. So you're very welcome to interact with me as we go if that's easier, but I'm not sure if I can see the chat bar while my screen's being shared, so we'll just see how we go. But yeah, very keen for questions afterwards and things like that.
Yeah.
So I'll run you through agriculture's relative contribution to climate change, which is sort of quite important to get that wider context of how everything works. What net zero actually means, because I know the word gets sort of bandied about quite a lot, but a lot of people don't quite understand what it means in practice. So I'll go through livestock, crops, soils and trees, all quite briefly, hopefully. And then a very, very brief introduction to carbon accounting before Becky gets into the good stuff. So to start with, I think it's quite important that we acknowledge climate change is happening. It's no longer a problem that we can sort of deal with in 10, 15, 20 years. The maps that you can see here are from last year, so showing that on average the country was significantly hotter. There was about, well actually to be fair, in your part of the world the rainfall was a bit closer to average, but a change in weather patterns in terms of rainfall. And as you can see, we also had quite a bit more sunshine, although again, maybe not so much in your part of the world. And then just to give you a bit of comparison, the middle map is now the rainfall that we had in February. So massive amounts of rainfall then, and then this one that's just come up here is the average sunshine in April. So I think it was not the hottest, but the sunniest April on record. So it sort of just shows that we are seeing a big change in weather events at the moment, and it's only going to get worse unless we can, you know, globally do something about it. So it does seem like a very big problem, but I think that there's a lot of ways that individual farmers and landowners and land managers in a country like the UK can actually be world leaders, I think, in this space. So this graph shows how agriculture compares to other sectors of the economy. So proportionately, it is only 10% of UK greenhouse gas emissions, 14.5% globally. But if you can see from the graph, all of the other sectors are, some quite slowly, but they are all slowly decarbonising. And agriculture, the green line, has remained pretty much static since about 2009, I think. There was a bit of a dip in sort of the early 2000s, but that had more to do, I think, with foot and mouth disease and milk quotas and stuff like that. Not so much efforts to actively reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but more just a change in the market and yeah, a sort of change in farming. So it is quite important to realise that as all these other sectors start reducing their emissions, it's quite likely that that proportion of agriculture will just get greater, and it will increase calls from other sectors to do more, basically. So it's quite important that we start figuring out how we can get those emissions down. So the main emissions that are associated, greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with farming systems are methane, that's the bulk of it, that comes from livestock and from slurry management and stuff like that. The remainder of it is nitrous oxide, which is mainly from the use of artificial fertilisers, but also soil management, and I think slurry as well. And then the last little percentage is carbon dioxide, which is usually associated with farm transport and stuff like that. And also heating, you know, that heating of, what's the word I'm looking for, like pigs and poultry units or stuff like that. So very different to other sectors where energy, for example, the bulk of it's likely to be carbon dioxide. And quite rightly, that is acknowledged by the government and the Committee on Climate Change and things, that carbon dioxide is the priority to reduce. And methane and nitrous oxide are quite different greenhouse gases, and we need to tackle them in completely different ways to carbon dioxide. But it is important to realise how different agriculture is as a sector. So in terms of what that means for, or what net zero means really, the UK signed the Paris Agreement a few years ago, which basically was a pledge to try and keep global warming to certain levels, and then became the first major economy to pass net zero emissions legislation, swiftly followed by New Zealand, I will add, which is where I'm from, in case you didn't pick up on the accent. So it's world leading in that respect, but it also means that the government is now legally obligated to make some changes. Legally obligated to get to net zero by 2050 means quite drastic policies will be needed. And what that means for agriculture, we still don't quite know, but we've got a pretty good idea of the direction of travel. And I'll run through some of those policies shortly. After the net zero legislation was announced, there are a lot of different reports. This is 4 of what must be hundreds. There was literally one today from the Wildlife Trusts. There's been ones from the National Audit Office, all sorts of reports, basically outlining what net zero and what climate change means for land use in the widest respect: agriculture, forestry, peatland, all of that, and talking about policies to get there. So this has been quite good. You know, it's good that everyone's putting a lot of thought and a lot of effort into it, and that there's reports coming from the government, there's reports coming from the UN, environmental groups, farmer groups, everyone's sort of coming together to try and tackle this problem and looking at it from a bunch of different angles, which is very helpful when you're a policy advisor for a farming organisation, because it means they sort of do all the work for you. But yeah, so it's been really good that this is sort of coming up the radar and that people are looking at it, I think, in quite a pragmatic way, which you might not guess from a lot of the media, which I'm sure hasn't escaped many people's attention, is that when we talk about climate change in agriculture, it does often centre around meat and diet change. And I think it gets the headlines and misses a lot of the deeper nuances. It's not necessarily incorrect that a plant-based diet will have a lower carbon footprint than a meat-based diet, but it, you know, throwing out headlines like that just completely misses so many of the kind of deeper debate points and nuances and different farm systems of different countries. You know, I get very frustrated every time I see these programs on TV that I'm sure have, you know, good intentions and things, and then they just show, you know, aerial shots of US feedlots, and you think, well, it doesn't actually mean anything here. But your average, you know, London-based viewer, not looking at myself, London-based, but you know, they're not going to realise that that's actually not how it works in the UK, which is sort of where we come to in terms of things like carbon accounting. We need to kind of reclaim the narrative, I think, and start finding our own forms of data and our own evidence, I guess, that actually agriculture in this country and land use in this country can be part of the solution to climate change. And I think that does really start with understanding each farmer's individual farm system and what they can do better, or where their emission hotspots are and things like that, which again, I think Becky will go into a bit more detail on. So in terms of what the word net zero actually means for each different farm system, I'll race through this because I don't want to spend too much time talking about any of this in case it's stuff that Becky might cover too. But as I briefly touched on earlier, the main emissions from livestock are methane through the enteric fermentation digestive system. It is very different to fossil fuels taken out of the ground and burns carbon dioxide, but that's not to say it's not still a very important part of the whole picture, and if there's ways we can reduce it, we should, basically. In terms of what a low carbon livestock system looks like, the reality is it's going to be different on every different farm. You know, the Committee on Climate Change recommends that we go to intensive livestock production because per unit of product it has a lower emissions footprint, but an intensive livestock system has a whole lot of other potential issues that aren't taken into account. They might be importing feed from deforested areas in the Amazon or something like that, and then you might have a pasture-based system where the cattle take longer to get to carcass weight, so they're on the earth for longer, so they've got more emissions, but they're not, you know, eating imported soy or whatever. So it's just so complicated, and there's no kind of one answer or one perfect system. It's all entirely dependent on the individual farm, basically, and the individual farmer, how they choose to approach it. There are kind of, very generally, the more productive the farm, the lower emissions. But again, it is very complicated, and it's the kind of nuance that gets missed, I think, in the wider conversation around climate change. And yeah, definitely gets missed in the conversation about diet. There's I think this does receive a lot of media attention, but when it comes down to it, UK produced beef is 2.5 times more efficient than the global average. So if people are going to be eating meat, there's a strong argument to say that it should be UK meat. And the way I always think about it is, because we import so much, the carbon footprint, see if I get this right, the carbon footprint of the meat consumed in this country is higher than the carbon footprint of the meat produced in this country, because we import less efficient meat. So I guess the message is just buy British in that sense. And crop systems, I'm not sure how many of you are arable farmers, but there are also significant emissions associated with the fertiliser in crops. Mainly nitrous oxide, which is 298 times, I think, more potent than carbon dioxide. So not insignificant. It's also an ozone depleter, I think. So all around, not a great greenhouse gas, if there is one. But there's also some emissions associated with farm transport, so tractors or whatever it is. Again, there's no real answer to what is a low carbon arable system, but basically anything that keeps the soil where it is as much as possible, minimum till, uses as little fertiliser as possible, so precision agriculture techniques, things like that. The less fertiliser used, the lower the emissions, which may lead you to think that an organic system is best, because obviously an organic system uses significantly less / no fertilisers and pesticides. But again, it's estimated that I think 50% of the global population wouldn't be able to eat, basically, if we didn't have if we didn't have artificial fertilisers. So they're really important for food production. And I think it was a Cranfield University study, but they had a look at what would happen if the entirety of the UK went organic, and it ended up with higher emissions, I think, because we had to import so much food. So again, there's no sort of one obvious answer. It's all about how an individual farm system works and what they sort of choose to do. Soils is also a big one that's been coming up a lot recently. So how soils fit into the wider climate change picture is really important. It got flat out ignored in the last Committee on Climate Change report, which we were really disappointed about, because it is a huge part of the whole picture. We've got 80 billion tonnes, I'll check my notes, of 10 billion tonnes of carbon stored in UK soils, which is equivalent to 80 years of UK emissions. And if we lose all of that, it's obviously would be awful in terms of our carbon footprint as a country. So although there is limited evidence as to how much more carbon can be sequestered in some circumstances in some farm systems, it doesn't mean that what's there shouldn't be protected at all costs, essentially. So yeah, I think the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that there's the top 30 centimetres of the world's carbon contains twice as much, sorry, if I'm going to get this right, the top 30 centimetres of the world's soil contains twice as much carbon as the whole atmosphere. So it is really important, and soil health, as I'm sure you're all aware, underpins, every farm system, is just as important as, well, probably the most important thing. How does farming impact soil carbon? Again, this is a tricky one, but it entirely depends on the farm system. There's evidence that incorporating livestock can be beneficial, but equally too many livestock and you can start losing carbon. So it's all about the individual farm and what they choose to do. But we are really big on soil testing. We think it's really important for farmers to get a good idea of how much carbon they've got in their soils, and then track year on year and assess their improvements. You can even just do it visually. You can take a sample from the same place year on year, take photos of it, and even that gives you enough to kind of get started and have an idea of what you're working with essentially. And it's also actually just been was included in the last iteration of the agriculture bill that included soil health as a public good, which was exciting. It wasn't in the first draft, I don't think, and we were quite upset about that. So we lobbied really hard to get it in, and that's been great. So that means hopefully in the future farmers will be rewarded for the health of their soils. Trees, the other big one. We've just had the England Tree Strategy published last week, 2 weeks ago, and that covers everything: forestry, woodland and agroforestry. The Committee on Climate Change is recommending that we increase tree cover in this country from 12% to 17%, I think. So that's about 1.5 million hectares by 2050. Maybe it's 1.2, I can't remember. It's a lot of trees, I think, is the moral of that story. It's, I think we need to be planting between 30,000 and 50,000 hectares per year. And I think last year or the year before, the UK averaged just under 10,000 maybe. And so we're obviously pretty far off that target and need to, find a way to incentivise tree planting in a way that still promotes food production. Which is where we get to the right place, right tree, right time, right purpose, because it does also matter what happens to the trees at the end of their life, I suppose, whether they're harvested or, and what happens to their harvest. If they're burnt for fuel, it's obviously quite different to if they're turned into a house, which might store the carbon for longer. So trees, again, really important part of the picture, but not that simple, which is sort of the moral of the whole climate change story, unfortunately. So in terms of how the government is trying to incentivise a move towards net zero for agriculture and land use, we know that they are replacing the current subsidy system with an environmental land management scheme, of which climate change mitigation is listed as a public good. So it's looking increasingly likely that climate change or measures to improve your carbon footprint, for example, will be incentivised. So that's hopefully good news. You know, it's hopefully going to be quite a positive incentive-based system as opposed to regulatory-based. They're also talking, there's sort of whispers in government about a farm emissions reduction plan, and this has changed over the last year actually, and even in the last few months they're still kind of figuring out how it will fit into ELMS. I'm really hoping that they change the name, because I know they love acronyms and I don't really like the acronym FIRP. It just doesn't really work for me, but it'll be interesting to see what that ends up looking like, how it fits in with ELMS, and whether it does have some regulatory elements. Like I know that they're considering covering the entirety of England in designating it all as a nitrate vulnerable zone, which would have significant implications on water quality and also on nitrous oxide, but will make things quite difficult for a lot of farmers. And so we're trying to find a kind of nice middle ground where people reduce the amount of nitrogen they use and improve the water quality and things, but without necessarily going for this sort of blanket ban, which could impact farm businesses quite significantly. So last week we had the England Tree Strategy published, which is a government it's the government's way of saying, right, we need 30,000 hectares of trees a year, how are we going to do it? So the CLA is in the process of responding to that consultation, and we've been working with them really closely for months, actually, nearly a year probably, as they've developed this strategy. And I think what is really important to know that on the trees front, highly productive agricultural land is not going to be the candidate for new tree planting. And equally, protected habitats, peatland, moorland, like that, none of that is likely to be considered as sort of viable land for these tree planting targets. So it does sound like a lot, and it can be quite scary for people, but it's also just about getting more individual trees on farms. So if there's hedgerows that could be doubled, or field corners or riparian strips or something like that, that all comes into it. It's not just about, you know, with sort of wide, large scale tracts of trees that I think people think about. And the Peatland Strategy has been published sort of in conjunction with that, and that came out yesterday with a 2-week consultation time frame. So I don't know how anyone's going to have enough time to properly respond to it. But that's the plan for the Peatland strategy, is to get basically all of the UK's upland and lowland peat into good condition. Not quite sure what good means, but it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out, because peat soils are really important carbon stores, and also really important habitats, but equally have cultural significance and yeah, and you know, good for water quality, good for flood mitigation. And so it is really important that we find a balance between still producing food on this land and allowing it to be productive, but also making sure that we don't degrade it, I suppose. So yeah, it'll be about finding a balance somewhere in that. Both of those strategies come under what they're calling the Nature for Climate Fund, which is a Conservative Party, was part of their manifesto, I think, to find, put money towards nature-based solutions for climate change. And then the exciting one that everyone always likes talking about is the potential for carbon markets. So there's been significant, or talk about significant funding from the private sector to pay for the carbon in trees or in soils. At the moment, there's a reasonably well-established market for the carbon stored in trees that is regulated, and yeah, you can enter in government contracts with it and that kind of thing. They're moving towards a similar scheme but for peatland. So peat soils that store and absorb more carbon will hopefully be able to, that carbon will be able to be traded and sold. So that's, I think, an exciting one to watch. It might, I do think that with you know, coronavirus, it's suddenly the landscape's changed a bit. I think, you know, high emitting companies like airlines who had all this extra money to play around with and would have been probably quite keen to start offsetting their emissions by planting trees and things. Obviously that's changed for them. This might be a bit, you know, lower down the priority list. But either way, I think it's really important that we keep an eye on it and make sure that when these markets do open up, they're accessible to your average farmer. You know, they're not just for those big, you know, people with thousands of acres who have lots of space to put into trees or whatever, that there's some room in there for private sector investment, for everybody basically. So I won't probably go into the carbon accounting stuff in any type of detail, but essentially the way that you can figure out what all this means on your individual farmers by doing a carbon account, counting up your emissions, which are there, your methane, your nitrous oxide and your carbon dioxide, balancing them against the carbon that might be sequestered out of the atmosphere on your farm, and that gives you your carbon account. If you are after any more information on this kind of stuff following the talk, I'm always very happy to have a chat over the phone or an email or anything like that, but the CLA has produced a page on climate change on our website called the CLA and the Road to Net Zero. It's really about not necessarily us getting to net zero, but about how land use and farming can contribute to the economy-wide net zero goal. Because farming will always produce emissions. Some of them biological. It's sort of an inescapable fact. So we're really trying to figure out how we can be part of the solution and change the way that we use land while producing food to move towards net zero. So that website has a guidance note that we've produced on carbon accounting, and it also has the report, which I think you hopefully received as part of the invite, but if not, I can send out, which it just basically goes through what I've talked about today, but in a lot more detail. It might be a bit heavy, it's a bit painful, I think, to read for some people, but others find it really interesting. So you're very welcome to go and have a look at that, or give me a call or an email. Thanks. Okay.
Well, thanks very much, Alice. That was great. Thank you.
Sorry, it was a bit of a race through it, I think.
Yeah. We'll just wait for questions at the end of Becky's talk. Becky, are you okay to pop on to yours? Or I've just put a little message on there to everybody. If anybody wants Becky or Alice's contact details, just let me know and we can forward those on.
Yep. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Can you all hear me all right? Yeah? Brilliant. Okay. Well, yeah, I will follow on from Alice's fantastic start. It's really nice to be here this evening. Thank you all very much for coming in from the beautiful sunny day, which I'm sure you've all had, and sitting in front of your computer for an hour in the evening when I'm sure you've got much better things to do. So it's great to be here. As I say, I'm Becky. I work for the Farm Carbon Cutting Toolkit, which is a massive mouthful of a name for an organisation. But basically what we do is we try and provide practical tools and resources to farmers to help understand how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, how we can improve energy resilience, how we can improve business resilience, how soil health fits into all that, and really start to help farmers navigate through this changing environment that Alice has told us about so far. So yeah, that's the organisation. Where do I fit into it? Well, as I say, I've been working for the organisation for the last 7 years. I've been involved in sort of carbon management and resource management for the last 15. And back in 2016, I spent 2 years substantially increasing my own carbon footprint, flying around the world doing a Nuffield scholarship on this subject of how do we communicate carbon reduction schemes to farmers. And one of the reasons that I did it back then was because, again, we put on events like this, we put on workshops and different meetings and have fantastic scientists who are doing really exciting stuff. And it wasn't really everyone's top priority, if I was putting it kindly, and we wouldn't get huge numbers. So it was really my Nuffield was really trying to look at how do we talk about this in a way which inspires farmers to engage with it, to get behind the use of carbon footprinting tools, understand what it means on their farm. If we fast forward to where we are now in 2020, obviously global pandemics aside, the environmental impact of agriculture has never been so much at the forefront, and what is really lovely to see so many of you here this evening to start to talk about this, which just shows how far we've come in terms of being able to understand what's going on. And I think Alice has really really well put out some of the policy changes and all that which is coming. So what I'm really going to focus on for the rest of this webinar is really how do we start to understand what's going on our farm? How do we go through the process of doing a carbon footprint? Why do we need to manage carbon on farm? And then sort of have a bit of a quick look at some of the emission sources that we've got, what the options are for sequestration, talk to you a little bit about a research project that we're doing at the moment looking to try and quantify the benefits of soil health. And I'm going to try and squeeze that all into 25 minutes. And apologies, I'm very sad, I get very excited about this sort of stuff. So if I'm going too long, Carol, please just shut me up. So why should we manage carbon on farm? Well, as I say, Alice has given a fantastic example so far of the bigger picture stuff. We've got policy that's interested, we've got the need for us as a country to start to reduce our emissions. But if we come back down and zoom right into the farm level, why should we manage carbon on farm? Well, it makes business sense. As Alice said earlier, there is a really good relationship between resources, improving resource use efficiency and profitability. So if we do it for no other reason, there are some really good opportunities for us to all reduce emissions and also improve our business performance, which is very good. It also, by doing a carbon footprint and by managing carbon on the farm, it allows us to be more informed. It allows us to understand the scale of our individual challenge to reach net zero. It allows us to understand where those main sources of emissions are on the farm, what's going on in terms of sequestration, and allows us to make decisions. So when you're making management decisions in terms of, what shall I do with my livestock? Shall I increase my herd? Shall I change my grazing management? Shall I do anything in terms of revitalizing some of my old pastures? All that sort of stuff. You can do that with an understanding of the impact of your management on your carbon performance and carbon credentials. It enables a positive narrative, and my goodness me, don't we need a positive narrative for our industry at the moment, especially around livestock, and Alice has already touched on that, so I'm not going to spend huge amounts of time. But what data and what doing a carbon footprint allows you to do is really reframe that discussion and have a much more positive and open discussion with our consumers, because it gives you ownership of the data and ownership of that narrative and allows us to change the story. It creates more resilient businesses, and it future-proofs us. So it starts us to understand what are the things that I might need to focus on in my business in the future in order to start to reduce emissions and look at sequestration. And that all of that starts with doing a carbon footprint, and it goes back to that old adage of you can't manage what you don't measure. So that process of actually doing carbon footprint is the first thing that we need to look at. You know, it's that first vital step and being able to quantify the contribution that your farm is making to climate change. And Alice said earlier, and just put very simply, what a carbon footprint does is it identifies the source and the quantity of those 3 different gases, so carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, that are being emitted from the farm. And then it highlights areas where you might want to look at, you know, changing your management to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It allows you to become more aware and make more informed decisions. But those metrics that are used, so the carbon footprint that you do and the software package that you use, they must be relevant. So they must make sense for your business. They need to be practical. So they need to be telling you things which actually mean that you can go and, you know, understand what that's moving to you and start to change things off the back of it. They need to be consistent, and this is one of the big problems that we've had with carbon footprinting in the UK, in the fact that you can do your carbon footprint with different software packages, and you'll get 3 completely different results, which is not good and is not what we need to be on. And it's something that, you know, we are trying to look at how we can get a consistent standard that all of these tools can work to, but that standard has to be fit for purpose. And one of the problems that we've had in the past is that the current standard, which is out there, you know, the publicly available specification for carbon footprints, doesn't take into account a lot of those positive things that we need it to take into account, like sequestration, like those farmers that are producing their own renewable energy, and all those other sort of things. So we need an update of the standards, and then we can start to get that consistency. But the really important thing is that once you've been through the process of doing that carbon footprint, hopefully you don't need to go and lie down in a darkened room for 3 weeks and get over the process, and you can actually use that as the starting point to say, right, what do I do with it? Because it's really designed to be, it needs to be a living document. It needs to be that starting point for you to then say, right, what am I going to do differently? And how can I start to reduce my emissions and look at the potential for sequestration? As I just said, you know, you can sit down and you can, you know, you can get out the greenhouse gas inventory that DEFRA produce, and you can pull out all the different emissions factors. But there are software packages that do it for you. Here in the UK, we have three main carbon calculators. We have the Cool Farm tool, we have AgriCalc, and then we have the Farm Carbon Calculator, which I'll talk to you a bit about now. And those tools make that footprinting process a lot easier, but they're not compatible with each other, as I just said. So choose one that works for you and stick with it, because otherwise, I say, if you switch calculator, you're not going to be able to, and you get a change, that change, you can't guarantee that that's coming from management. It's probably just the fact that different tools use different boundaries. So why do those reports and those results differ? Well, as I just said, they include or exclude certain things. So some tools will include, energy, some energy production. Some tools won't. Some tools depend on a much more focused on looking at following all the way through a supply chain. So, for example, following everything that goes into producing a kilo of beef. And some are more looking at the whole farm and what the farm is producing in terms of some of those benefits. Some don't include carbon sequestration and some do. But when you choose one, the key question is, what do you want to know? So why are you doing a carbon footprint? You know, if you're doing a carbon footprint because you want to market your carbon credentials at the end of it, and you want to start having a different conversation with your consumers, then you need to choose a tool that's transparent in its methodology, so it's very open about what's included and what's not, and is reliable and is sort of rubber stamped, as it were. If you're looking for a tool that explains, you know, what should I change in terms of my management, then you might want one that you have to put a bit more information in so that you can actually adequately see the impact of your management. And if you're just looking for one, you know, what's your level of interest in it? How much time have you got to complete it? And how complex is it? So those are just the sort of things to think about. So our carbon calculator, as I say, it goes under the same sort of ethos of Farm Carbon Toolkit, as it's been designed by farmers for farmers. It's completely free to use. You can create as many accounts as you want. You can create as many different carbon scenarios for your farm. You could do 100 of them. We're not going to charge you anything, and it's never going to be behind a paywall. It's always going to be free. It accounts for soil carbon sequestration. And the way that it currently does that, which I'll talk to you more about in a bit, is that you have to have 2 years worth of soil organic matter results. But what we're doing is that we're just linking it at the moment to our soil carbon research project to allow us to populate the models that sit behind it. So for those farmers that potentially haven't done any soil organic matter tests before, but they know what management practices they're doing and what their soil types are, they'll be able to put that information and get an idea of what's happening in terms of carbon sequestration. As Alice said earlier, it provides your footprint as a carbon dioxide equivalent. So with agriculture, as Alice said, we're more complicated. We're not just dealing with one gas, we're dealing with 3 gases. So what it does is it translates those gases, so for carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane, and it reports your carbon balance as a carbon dioxide equivalent. But within that, you're also able to see where those different gases are being produced. So you can see the amount of nitrous oxide that's coming off, and you can see the amount of methane. We're also doing some work at the moment looking to include this new methane methodology, though there's been some work that's been done by some professors at Oxford, looking at the fact that, as Alice alluded to earlier, that methane doesn't behave in the same way as carbon dioxide, and so the traditional way of accounting for it is slightly overestimating what's going on with methane. So we are at the moment, your carbon balance will show you using the traditional way of measuring, but we've also modelled in there the new way of measuring methane so that you can start to understand the impact of that change in metric if that comes along. And as I say, it had a big new update at the end of last year and was launched back at Oxford in January at the beginning of this year. So how do we do it? Well, you log in and you register. Once you put your information in, that information doesn't go zipping off to the RPA or anybody else. It's there. It's just there for your account. And as I say, the idea behind it is that you actually create something that is of use to you. So it's not going anywhere. It's very secure. Collate your data first. That is the bit that is the pain in the backside. I will hold my hands up. Collecting all that information that you need to put in is the time-consuming bit. But once you've done it once, you've then done that painful process. And next year, when you go back and do your footprint, you can copy last year's footprint and just update the bits that have changed. So you really only have to go through that hideously painful process once. And then you create a report and enter your data. And this is what it looks like. So you've got different pages. This is the fuel page, and you can see down there the entries of everything that's gone onto that page. You can see that donut chart in the middle, which is showing you how the emissions associated with fuel are broken down. So you can see that just over half of the emissions from fuel are coming from this farm's red diesel usage. And then on the right hand side there, you can see all of those different categories under which you need to put information. So fuels, materials is what you use on the farm in a typical year. So if you did any maintenance projects, fencing, all those sort of things. Inventory is the capital cost associated with your machinery and your equipment. Crops is obviously what you're growing in terms of any cropping. Chemicals is around input, so fertilizers, ag chem, all that sort of thing. Livestock, so types of livestock, how they're being managed and what you're feeding them. Waste, in terms of if you're generating any waste and what's happening with that. And then distribution and sequestration. So you put in all the information in all those different things, and then you get your carbon balance. And put simply, carbon balance is emissions, take away sequestration, which give you your balance. And unlike your bank account, a negative figure here is a good thing, okay? Because this shows you that you're actually pulling in more carbon than you are producing as a business, which is fantastic. So, you know, at this point, you can then start to say, well, is this the result of something that I do year on year? So is this an average year? In which case, we go back to Alice and we say, well, who's going to pay me for this option? Or is it that you're doing something different this year and you're just taking account of that? And when you start to do that process of carbon footprinting, you can really start to see some of these things. And that's where the interpreting results comes from. It's so important, and it's a key part of the process. It allows you to evaluate where you are currently and plan the farm strategy for the future in terms of how you reduce emissions and also improve sequestration. And it gives you that evidence in terms of changing management. So if I did, you know, if I managed to cut my fertilizer use by 5%, what would that do to my footprint? If I changed the way I was managing my stock, what would that do to my footprint? And you can start to, as I say, have a more involved and a more evidence-based discussion. Okay, so that's footprinting my word is completely gone. How it fits. But what can we actually do about it? And that really starts by looking at, well, where do the emissions come from? And I take the point there is no such thing as a typical farm, and all of our farms are different, and that's one of the reasons that makes this whole thing really, really complicated. But if we were to pretend that there was such a thing as a typical farm, and an arable farm, about 60% of those emissions would be coming from fertilizer production and application. So Alice said at the beginning, that Haber-Bosch process is incredibly energy intensive, and one of the other problems with that is obviously nitrous oxide is a leakage. So as they make nitrogen fertilizer, nitrous oxide is one of the byproducts of that process. So it's bad in terms of it's energy intensive, and it's also producing reducing nitrous oxide. And then when you get it on the farm, what you do with it in terms of how you apply it and the soil conditions will have a big impact. Fuel use and field operations, so that's diesel for your for driving your tractors around, but that's also cultivation that's going on, because what I say, as well as burning of fossil fuels within carbon emissions, you've also got carbon losses from soil when it's cultivated. About 10% is coming from P&K fertilizer, the use of manures and lime. About another, just under 10% is coming from the emissions associated with those seeds that you're planting, getting them to the farm, and then a very small percentage is coming from crop protection, so from your ag chems. If we look at a ruminant livestock farm, about half of their emissions are coming from enteric fermentation, so that opportunity that our ruminants have to take that long undigestible forage and turn it into meat and milk. But obviously a byproduct of that is methane, and unlike the BBC would like you to believe, 98% of that methane comes out the front end, not out of the back end, and as I say, it's actually a loss of potential energy that could be captured and used to produce either more meat or milk. So there's lots of innovations going on at the moment around that. 20% coming from manures, about 10% coming from fertilizer use, now another 10% coming from diets, and then 10% from power and fuel. So that's how it tends to break up. And for all farms, there are 5 key actions to focus on. So firstly, if you're not a livestock farmer, then don't focus on optimizing livestock performance. But if you are, then certainly looking at how you can create a more efficient livestock system is a really good starting point. And it's something that you'll all be doing anyway, around looking at feed conversion efficiency, around looking at daily live weight gain and growth rates, around looking at things like fertility management, reproductive efficiency, health. They're all the things that you're doing anyway as part of trying to develop your resilient business. They all have a benefit in terms of helping to drive sustainable livestock systems, looking at what they're being fed and all those other sort of things, and how you're managing grazing. Soils, fertilizers and manures, again, we could spend a whole evening talking about all the things in there. Basically, it's around looking after your soil structure, so making sure that it's in good structural health, because when it's compacted and it's wet, it's releasing nitrous oxide, which we don't want. It's looking at how we integrate fertilizers and manure usage, so making sure that we're doing nutrient management planning. Nutrient management planning is a win-win on every sort of pollutant / environmental measure that you'd want to do, and it saves money as well, so it's a really good one to start with. But there's also some interesting innovations coming on with different coatings for fertilizers to allow fertilizer applications to more match crop demand, so it's slowing that release down. And there's some interesting work, as Alice said earlier, around the use of precision farming and all those other bits and pieces. But soils, fertilizers and manure, again, a really good opportunity to save money as well as start to reduce emissions. Energy and fuel use is really, really boring, but makes a real difference. And it's one of those jobs that nobody ever gets around to doing in terms of looking at an energy audit and a fuel audit. But we've got a couple of farmers that we've worked with, over the last couple of years, and we've managed to save all the farmers that we've done help with energy and fuel audits. We've managed to save them all at least $5 grand, and we've managed to cut their emissions associated with it. So it's one of those jobs that just looking at where you're using energy, looking at where you're using diesel, and starting to see if you could maybe adapt your management slightly. Renewable energy, if that's an option, and then the idea of how do we start to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and hold it on the farm. So those first 4 are really looking at how do we reduce emissions, but then where does sequestration fit into this? And Alice has already talked about the deal with trees. And if you think back to some of those election promises that were going on back in the autumn, if we can all remember before COVID, we were having tree ping pong going on in terms of how many trees we were going to plant. I'm going to plant 1 billion trees, I'm going to plant 1 trillion trees. If you think, well, why were they focusing on trees? They were focusing on trees because trees are easy to measure. We know how much carbon is held in a tree. We know how much carbon, is held in the tree, in the actual biomass versus what's in the soil, and we can measure that, and we can put it very nicely into a model. As Alice also said earlier, although I don't know how much you guys have got hedges up where you are, or whether you're walls, hedges are also a really good source of carbon. So they're, again, really worth managing and monitoring, and looking at how often you're cutting them and how often you're managing them. But then we've got this issue of soil carbon, and soil carbon can be that often overlooked opportunity, both in terms of protecting the soil carbon that we've already got, and then looking at the opportunities to pull more carbon in. So what is soil organic carbon? Well, if you think about what makes up your soil, in an average soil, you've got about 45% of it, which is made up of rock and mineral. So those parent materials that are providing what your soil is textured, sand, silt, clay, all those sort of things. When a well-structured soil, we should have 25% water and 25% air. And then that remaining 5% is soil organic matter. Now, there's quite often a lot of confusion between soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. Soil organic carbon is 60% of soil organic matter, and it's basically the energy of the sun flowing through your soil, and it provides that fuel that the underground industry, which supports everything you do on your farm on top of your soil, it's that fuel that keeps everything going. And another way to think of it is to think about the soil ecosystem being the engine of the planet. It provides, you know, soil is so important, and it's great, as Alice said earlier, that it's now been recognised as a public good in there, because it's so important and it's so critical. I don't have to tell you guys because you manage it every day. But if you think of the soil ecosystem as the engine of the planet, then the carbon and the organic matter in carbon is that fuel to keep that engine going. So it's what drives the system and makes that soil do all the things that we need it to do. And if you look at, you know, the sort of soil health triangle or the soil health stool, you know, we've got those three different areas. So we've got the soil physics. So how well structured our soil is, whether we have achieved that, you know, quarter of our soil is air, quarter of our soil is water. And soil carbon is really, really important in that, because it provides that aggregate function. So it helps to stick the soil particles together. It helps to structure our soil. If we look at soil chemistry, you know, we know that in the soil is more phosphorus than we could ever possibly need. The problem is it's not an available form. Soil carbon starts to unlock that phosphorus and make it more crop available. So it actually can help reduce the amount of phosphate we've got to put on. And it's also the primer for that soil biology. But even if we're not looking at why we should, you know, why soil carbon is important, because, you know, for the sort of wider environmental issues, soil carbon actually increases our yields. Because actually, if we can increase our soil carbon, and this is some work that's been done in the States, then actually we're getting all our soil to function in the way that we want it to, around, you know, increased aggregation, around nutrient retention, around water use efficiency, and we're reducing all those things we don't want around, you know, erosion, runoff, compaction, which are the things that none of us want. So this is great, but how do we do it? Well, traditionally, under the traditional way of measuring, and some of the reports that the Committee on Climate Change base all their models on, the only way that we can increase soil organic carbon is by changing our land use. So if we're a grassland farm, if we're permanent pasture, the only thing we can do to that field to increase soil carbon in those traditional ways of measuring is to plant trees on it. If we're an arable farm, the only thing we can do is change our land use to grassland, or we can jump straight from arable to woodland to pull more carbon in. But we all know that we can go to, you know, within our grassland farm or within our cropping farm, we can have fields that perform brilliantly, and we can have fields that perform horrendously. I've got them at home as well, you know, and we can see the difference. So actually within those broad categories of grassland, arable and woodland, there is differences, and this is what we need to start to look at. We can also increase organic carbon by reducing the amount of it that's going out of the gate and disappearing down the road. So if we can keep the soil in the field to grow the crops and grow next year's crops, then that will help in terms of reducing losses. We can feed the soil in terms of organic amendments, so by putting on manures, by putting on green residues, and all those sort of things is really important. Reducing tillage, so reducing the amount of cultivation, which is turning that soil upside down and showing the soil to the oxygen, which is then oxygenating some of that carbon out, and looking at the potential of using deep roots. So these are some of the things that we're doing as part of the Soil Carbon Project. I haven't got huge amounts of time, but I'll just, you know, this came about because we run a competition called Soil Farmer of the Year, and we would go, which recognises those farmers who are doing fantastic things around soil management. And we would go and stand in some fantastic fields of grass and of crops, different things. And the farmer would say, you know, everything's changed. My system's brilliant. And I would say to them, that's fab. Did you take any tests before you started in terms, so we can, you know, look at the difference? They would say no, because I don't really know what tests to take. I'm not convinced that they work particularly well. So that's really what we're looking at in the Soil Carbon Project. How do we test for soil organic carbon? How is it linked to soil health? What does that mean in terms of the potential for farms being carbon, you know, net zero or even carbon positive? And I just wanted to pull out a couple of points that we're finding so far. We're finding so far that there's a real potential with the impact of grazing, and moving away from set stocking to rotational grazing and mob grazing if you want to go bananas, but just looking at at rotational grazing is improving soil carbon levels on our 90 farms that we're working with from about 0.1 to 0.6% per hectare per year. And what you'll find is if you can improve your soil organic matter by 0.1%, you're sequestering an extra 9 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. And not only that, you will also hold an extra 16,000 litres of water just with that increase in soil organic matter. So we're cautiously optimistic that there is a real opportunity here in terms of changing management. If you can include deep rooting species, so for those of you that have got temporary grassland and aren't just on permanent pasture, if you can start to put some of those deep rooting species, those chicories, those other species that put their roots down further, you can supercharge that process, because you're not just putting carbon in the topsoil, you're also putting carbon further down. And also that increasing use of legumes, so putting clovers in, will reduce the amount of fertilizer that you're putting on. So it reduces your emissions and helps in terms of carbon sequestration. So it's a double win. And the other thing that we're saying, Alice was talking about, looking at your soils, and obviously, we're taking quite a lot of soil samples as part of this project. But one of the things we're also trying to do is see if there's a relationship between soil carbon and some of these proxy indicators. And what we found is that soil aggregate stability, so doing a slake test, is the best test that you can all do. It doesn't cost you anything. You can go out and do it tomorrow. And we're seeing there's a really good relationship between that and soil carbon levels. So if you imagine your soil is like a biscuit that you're dunking in a cup of tea, what we want it to do is we want it to hold it together. So we don't want it to be one of those biscuits that you dunk in and it just goes bleh. We want it to hold itself together, and you want to be able to keep dunking it and it to stay together, because that glue that's holding your soil together is really, really important and is one of the precursors for carbon. So again, all you do is go out and take a handful of soil, leave it to dry on the windowsill for a couple of days, and then submerge it in a bowl of water and just watch what happens to it. And if it sticks together, and if it stays together over 5 minutes, and then go back and look at it again in a couple of hours, if it's still stuck together, you've got good levels of carbon. If it looks more like that picture in the bottom, then it's potentially something that we need to start looking at. So just to conclude, the time to act on this sort of stuff, as Alice said, is now. It's really important to start getting your head round how carbon will impact on your farm. That might be through doing a carbon footprint. That might be just by looking at, where you think some of the things are, the sources of emissions are on your farm. As Alice has already said, the level of regulation, bureaucracy and legislation is only going in one direction. But it's important to remember, not get too downhearted about the fact that we're going to have, all this new legislation and policy to deal with, but actually focus on the bit that if we can monitor business performance, we can actually drive efficiencies, we can get business benefits from doing this. And it does create business opportunities. We're working with farmers that are marketing their carbon credentials, and the consumers are desperate for it. You've got a lot of the anti-livestock stuff, but there are people that are ready for that positive story. And if you can do your carbon footprint, you can start to market that in a different way. But all of this needs data-driven decisions. So data is king. So having a carbon footprint allows you to have, you're much better informed in terms of having that conversation. We all need to develop skills and understanding and knowledge. This is an evolving science. We don't have all the answers yet. And pilot schemes. So how might things like carbon trading and all that sort of stuff work at a local level? And that's my details. So I'm very, very happy to answer any questions, but also if anybody would like to do a carbon footprint, as I say, I'm very happy to help them. All of my details are there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Becky. That was great. Kate, can I just hand it over to you? That's it, Becky, thank you. I think there's a couple of questions and statements there. Okay, you're not unmuted.
There are 3 questions to start with. I don't know if anybody's got access to has everybody tried out the chat button? See, you can see what's on there, and you can type in a question.
Do you want me to start answering some of it? I can answer that Tom Dillon one.
Yep. Do you want to say what it is?
So yeah, there's a question saying carbon buyers have codes for peat and woodland. What about regenerative agriculture, which builds up soil aggregation, etc.? Are farmers currently being paid for the increase in carbon in their soil? Probably not. Well, no, you're right. They're not being paid currently. But what is going through at the moment? So currently, in terms of carbon buyers and carbon credits, as Alice said earlier, we've got them set up for woodland. The peat one, Alice probably knows more than I do. But what's going on at the moment is that there's quite a lot of interest from businesses that are seeing that this is a really good business opportunity in terms of understanding how it all works in soil. As I've said, it's quite complicated, but there are some draft proposals out at the moment as to how we might verify, so how the testing bit might work, because there are schemes that are working around the world. So in Australia, in America and in Canada, they are paying farmers for soil carbon sequestration. They're doing it in a variety of ways. In Australia, it's all done on a measurement basis. So farmers have to go out and do a lot of measurement. They then liaise with you know, with either with actors, so with agents in the middle, or directly with the Emissions Reductions Fund, and they're able to do that. In America, it's based on a model-based system, so you put what you're doing in terms of your management practices, and the big carbon calculator understands how much carbon that's sequestering. And in Canada, they've got a hybrid model where it's half measurement, half model. But what we need to try and work out is how those sort of systems might work over here in the UK, which, as Alice said, we're much smaller scale. And how do we make sure that if we have a carbon trading system, the payments go back to the farmers rather than that middle ground of people that have to potentially aggregate lots of carbon together? How do we make that system work? But at the moment, there is a consultation out for the draft soil verification method, which we're feeding into, certainly some of our learning from the Soil Carbon Project. I don't know whether you wanted to add anything, Alice, from your policy side.
No, that was very comprehensive. The only thing that I would add is that we're doing a lot of work with DEFRA to make sure that outside of a code there will be government money for soil health improvement. So the private sector's one side of it, but we're making sure that that farmers will be paid for the soil health improvements that they can do on their farm through the new environmental land management scheme.
Cool. And the question from John saying, is measuring soil carbon alone enough of a measure of soil health, as carbon needs to be cycled? Should we not also be looking at cycling rates through measures like carbon to nitrogen ratio, respiration rate? So yeah, John, we're doing that as part of our soil carbon project. Sorry, I messed my timing up, so I didn't have enough time to talk about it at the end. But basically, one of the things that we're doing through that project is looking at the whole area of testing, because you make a really good point. Soil carbon is not the be all and end all. It's one part, it's one aspect of soil health, and it's something that a lot of there's been a lot of focus on, because it's something that we can measure. And obviously soil organic carbon is something that we can measure. But one of the things that we're doing is looking at how we take those, so we've got some of the farms that we're working with, which we've got those soil organic matter tests, we've got the soil organic carbon test. We're also looking at carbon to nitrogen ratios, we're looking at carbon to clay ratios, so looking at soil texture, and also looking at some of those biology things as well. There's a huge development at the moment looking in the different biological testing and how we can look at soil respiration and other things, and even down to sort of eDNA sequencing, the microbial biomass of what's in our soils. I'm very much making, where we come to is actually we need to be, with those biological tests, they need to actually be giving a result back to the farmer that has meaning, rather than just a sort of nice to know. How can you actually base your management on what comes back? But we have seen some really interesting results with carbon to nitrogen ratios, and we're just crunching the final numbers on how that works. But the other interesting thing we found is that those farmers that are potentially running more of a sort of regenerative approach, we've done some soil nutrient testing and started to see that those farmers that are using those sort of methods are actually managing to unlock more of the soil nutrients and some of those micronutrients as well, through the change in management. So it's all stuff that we've got to throw into the pot, definitely. And as those biological tests evolve, I think that we will get more and more sophisticated in them. But we need to make sure that we're actually getting some value out of the back of them. And then just finally, one from Bill. Yes, at the moment, obviously, FCCT tool just includes soil carbon, not soil carbon, sorry, just includes a carbon footprint. You are completely right. There are lots of other measures of sustainability around biodiversity, around water quality, around air quality. Certainly, there are certain practices which will benefit a lot of those things, and then there are other ones where you can sort of pick your pollutant. And I quite often get into some slightly interesting discussions with some of the ammonia mitigation lot when they're starting to advocate for things which are great for ammonia but aren't so good for nitrous oxide. So we've got to be a bit careful of making sure that we aren't generalising too much, but we're also starting to understand how we can minimize the amount of bureaucracy for you guys in terms of how many different blooming footprint things you have to do. So yeah, there is definitely an opportunity for to try and pull all this together and start to look at what are those practices and those options that are providing huge amounts of benefit, not just to carbon but also to wider sustainability things. And I think we need to probably get a bit better at communicating those. And the results from the soil carbon research, there is some on. I can send Carol and Kate a link which she can go around. We've got some on the website, and some of the others I'm just finishing crunching the numbers before we can put some bits out. But it's pulling out some interest. It's not finished yet. The project's still carrying on. But yeah, I can certainly send some results.
Thanks, Becky. And in those that research that you're doing, are you including like upland areas like the Yorkshire Dales and Cumbria? And
yeah, I've got some farmers in Cumbria that we're working with. I know we're going to do a little bit more of that, but certainly we are keen. So we are keen to get as many farming types, soil types, management systems involved as possible. We currently don't. I keep getting told off by my manager for adding more farmers on because everybody's so interesting, and I want to see what's going on. But we are currently applying for more funding so that we can include more farmers in that, so we can make sure that we have adequately taken account of different upland areas and that sort of thing. But what we're also doing is we're being very open and honest with how we're doing testing. So if there's other groups that might be interested in doing some of this work, we can share the protocols and what we're doing, and obviously provide you with some of the comparisons that's going on, so that we're trying to be as agile and as open and honest as possible, because we're all learning this sort of stuff together. Nobody's getting any sort of competitive advantage, so we all need to channel all of the learning from the scientists that have been doing this in very fine detail in little, in greenhouse experiments, to you guys, which are, the ultimate test lab, because you're doing stuff at systems level. And this is where the scientists sometimes get a bit unstuck, and it's why we have to say, because there's so many different things going on a farm, how do we start to pull things out? But we've got to start looking at some of that systems level science to move this thing forward. And as I say, we don't know all the answers yet, but we're making a start, which I think is the key point, really.
Thanks. That's really comprehensive. I think everybody will be impressed how you've answered all of those things and delivered that presentation. Are there any other questions for Alice or more for Becky? If you just raise your hand if you've got your screen on, or use the reactions thing button on the bottom. All right, yeah, I've got a question from Daniel that's just come to me. Daniel Rayson, other banks, etc., taking an interest. Is a carbon audit going to become a requirement for a loan on other business decisions, I suppose? Any thoughts on that, Alice, maybe?
Yeah, so we've been doing quite a lot of work with different banks, including Lloyds and HSBC, about how they're going to incorporate carbon footprints into some of their agribusiness work. At the moment, they advise it just as a kind of good practice thing to be doing, exactly what Becky was saying. It makes good financial sense for a farmer to have a look at their carbon footprint, and it also makes a big difference because, yeah, if you're reducing your carbon, you're often saving money. So yeah, they're advising it. At the moment, I don't think it's contingent on loans and things like that. But yeah, it's definitely part of their kind of ongoing work, and they're doing a lot of work with CLA on that. You might know more, Becky, I'm not sure. I
was just going to say, certainly, so we're just at the start, and Lloyds are launching something next week, I think, which will be for all of their agricultural customers, that there's the opportunity to do carbon footprinting. And some of you might have seen that there was a piece out in the media recently about the carbon footprint of banks, and obviously the sort of fall down from that. And so at the moment, it's a bit like some of the other large supply chains. They're just looking in terms of what's happening with their supply chains. But again, it may well be a case that actually, it's going to become more of that in the future. But at the moment, it's just an awareness raising, and obviously, it helps them in their resilience planning. There isn't anything in terms of that's going to be conditional on a loan, but I'm not saying that won't come in the future, but at the moment it's just it's just an option that they're trying to do to help farmers start to plan these things moving forward.
Thanks. There's another question for Becky from Bill, asking about the tests you're recommending for testing for soil organic matter, and which laboratory.
Yeah, so we've been doing a couple of things with this. So we've been testing soil organic matter, soil organic carbon, as I said earlier, and a lot of sort of weird and funky tests. The two main things to remember when you're doing soil tests for soil organic matter is firstly to whichever lab you use. And we've got some calibration going on at the moment, so we've sent samples off to all of the main labs. And we're doing some work looking at trying to sort of standardize that process because the labs do things differently. So the two main golden rules are, firstly, whichever lab you use, make sure you stick with that lab. So if you use NRM, when you then next test, use NRM. If you use land crop, use land crop again next time, because they will be using the same protocol. And the other really important thing is the time of year that you take the sample. So actually, it's really important to make sure that when you take your soil sample, so you take it and then you next take it, you take it at the same time of year, because we've been running a couple of plot trials looking at the impact of seasonality on soil organic carbon, and it's massively variable. So we've got some fields down at the college down in Cornwall where we've taken a grass field and arable fields where we've taken samples at each month, and there's a big change. So it's really important to make sure that you take your sample at the same time of year. And then, as I say, you use the same lab, and making sure that we are looking at loss on ignition. We've also done some calibration for the DUMAS method and Albrecht and all the other fun and games. But if we look at what the potential is for what we're going to get paid on in the future, I can't imagine DEFRA using some of those more expensive soil organic, still it's going to be loss on ignition, with all its many foibles, with, as I say, hopefully some sort of some verification in there as well. But just that's a good starting point. But also what's really important, as I say, is do an aggregate stability test. Look at, dig a hole, look at what the condition of your soil. Do you have loads of worms? Do you have all that sort of stuff? Because that gives you a load of good information as well, and you can start to then compare that to what's under the hedge or under the wall, or in a different part of your field. So you can start to look at where you can get to, and that gives you as much day-to-day management information as your soil organic matter will. The soil organic matter will help you mark a point in time and then show you whether you're moving in the right direction, but actually digging holes is really important as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Becky. Just following up on that, if you live in a part of the world that's got longer winters, like the Pennines or
Yep.
the Lake District, if you've got longer time in the winter, does that affect the carbon stability or the emissions or the sequestration balance?
It will impact on nitrous oxide emissions if you've got cold, wet soils for longer. Right. So those will be produced, but again, it's how you manage them. So if you're making sure that they're not compacted, if you're trying to reduce the amount of poaching that you've got going on, or if if you're going to have to outwinter stock, make sure that you keep them to try and sort of minimize the damage, and then think about those things that you might want to do in the spring to actually start to mitigate some of those issues. But yeah, I mean, this is one of the problems, as Alice said earlier. We're dealing with a leaky system, so agriculture produces emissions irrespective of what we do. And so our job is to try and minimize the amount of emissions that are coming out by trying to optimize our management. So looking at soil health, looking at what we're doing in terms of fertilizer applications and manure applications, looking at how we're managing our livestock to try and protect soil health, to try and minimize the impact of those livestock. But we are producing emissions because it's a biological system, and as I say, we have a winter like we've just had, then our soils are producing nitrous oxide anyway, because it's just not stopped raining, and they're cold and they're wet. So we're never gonna eliminate all emissions. But what's also really important to remember is that we've got one of the solutions in terms of we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. They're investing millions and millions of pounds into these funky drills that they can drill down to the core of the earth. We can do it with green leaves, so we need to be sort of showing the positives of that. But yeah, climatic conditions make a difference.
And there's just a last question from John Telfer about the carbon that's locked up in chalk, and yep. Are we just measuring soil carbon or no?
So we're looking, so definitely there's an issue on chalky soils, and that's why we take, sometimes the DUMAS method is used, because it shows that in terms of how much of the carbon is actually being lost, or what's in there, and it can show an artificially high mark. But that's what we're looking to try and see how we can do stuff on chalky soils. As I say, chalky soils, quite often it's the DUMAS method that's used because it gives a more accurate understanding. But also talking about carbon stocks versus sequestering stuff. So the other thing that we're looking at is also looking at the impact of if we look at soil organic matter as a percentage, it's quite a blunt instrument. And so the work that we're doing is also looking at talking about it in terms of yield of carbon. So if you look at the depth at which the sample's taken, and you look at the bulk density, and you look at what's there, and it actually starts to allow you to see that you can have two fields that are both at potentially 8% soil organic matter or 5% soil organic carbon, but one field could be holding 20 tons of carbon and the other field could be holding 200 tons of carbon, because the concentration of that carbon is different. And it's so carbon stocks is really important, understanding how much is there already that we need to protect versus how much extra we can pull in. And I think, going back to what Alice was saying, we may well in the future see two completely different payment systems for that. I think we might have a carbon protection payment from Natural England or whoever comes after Natural England, and then we're not going to let the RPA or Natural England anywhere near carbon trading, because they would just mess it up. So I think that sits completely separately.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much, Becky, for such comprehensive answers, and Alice. I think hopefully we've covered all the questions that people had. I don't know, Carol, do you want to bring in anybody else, or it's 8:20 now, I realise.
Yes, we're getting on for time. Steve, you do a little bit on your farm to do with your milk contract, don't you? Would you like to just sort of say something about that, or you just unmute yourself, Steve? Just unmute yourself. Okay, can you unmute him?
Is that doing it?
Oh, that's it. Yeah, sorry, Steve.
No, you're all right. What I've been listening to tonight, very interesting, is we started about 2014 with Nestle and Coaltail to do carbon footprinting, and it's absolutely right. It is a really good tool for looking at your business in another way. It's a huge thing to start and take on, as we've heard tonight. But the only way to start is to start, and that's what we've done. It's a good tool, and we're still doing it. And it's one of the things the Nestle contract asked us to do, because obviously their customers want to see it. So, yeah.
Oh, thanks, Steve. If there's nothing else from anybody else, I wonder if we could close the meeting. I want to thank Alice and Becky hugely for their input tonight. It's been really, really interesting. If you have any more further questions after something pops up in your mind later on, don't hesitate to get in touch with me at the Farmer Network, and I can sort of mitigate between the two speakers. So I just want to thank you all very much for taking the time tonight to come and listen, and I'll say good night to you all.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Carol.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye.